I could add one more. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here for our last Institute for Sustainability and Resilience Biocultural Initiative specific seminar series presentation of the semester. We have Dr. Kawika Winter. Most of you know at this point, but Institute for Sustainability and Resilience, one of our core functions is to bring together and help coordinate sustainability research and curriculum across campus. And we've been super excited to partner with the Biocultural Initiative of the Pacific in programming, research, and curriculum. And part of that is the seminar series. So to introduce Kawika, I will bring up Dr. Tamara Tickton, one of the, Dr. Alex Moyer.
I can't do tomorrow.
the leader of Biocultural. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you. Aloha mai kako. I'm Alexander Moyer. I'm the current director of UH's Center for Pacific Island Studies. And since 2014, one of the leadership GUI for our Biocultural Initiative. And I just want to here in the last session of the year, thank ISR for all the support and the reorganization and recentering of this initiative. And thanks to all of you as well. This Biocultural Initiative of the Pacific has been more abundant, more thriving, more plural all year long, in part thanks to ISR. So thanks so much, Leah and McKenna and Ketty and the whole team there. Introducing this colleague is probably no mean feat. In himself, he represents and embodies a number of the most curious and I think that what have been some of the most generative scholarly movements of the last decades. In himself, he embodies and performs the division of the land, the absolute collapse of the land-sea division as an insufficient model of relations between scholars who work in botanical or terrestrial contexts and scholars who work in marine contexts. In himself, he embodies the absolute collapse and erosion and setting aside of the nature-culture dichotomy. This idea that to study nature as natural scientists means that you leave outside of the room all of the cultural knowledges in the social sciences or the humanities, or all the cultural knowledges held by aunties and uncles and community members here in Kapaina, Hawaii, or across the region. In himself, he in himself, he helps us understand that we can set aside that distinction between those of us who have PhDs or MAs or think of ourselves as scholars as part of our label, and those of us who think of ourselves as stewards and who engage in stewardship in everyday spaces towards indigenous and local futurities across all nature domains. And in himself, the land, he loves the sea. He represents a blue-green composite that reminds me of my favorite color, turquoise. Many beautiful things are plural. Dr. Kawika Winter is a transdisciplinary scholar who broadly operates at the intersection of science, indigenous stewardship, and policy. He has a research focus on elucidating the ecological foundations of indigenous resource management. After spending more than a decade in the green sector, Dr. Winter returned to the University of Hawaii at Manoa in 2018 and now has various appointments at the university, including at the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology, as well as in the graduate programs of botany and natural resources and environmental management. Dr. Winter is currently the director of Heia National Estuarine Research Reserve, which is a collaborative stewardship endeavor between the University of Hawaii at Manoa, the Native Hawaiian community of Heia, and the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. In the policy sphere, Dr. Winter serves on the federal government's Ocean Research Advisory Panel, no pressure, the state of Hawaii's Endangered Species Recovery Committee, thank you, and also sits on the Advisory Council for the Hawaii Conservation Alliance. As one can see, he is singular.
Mai kako. Ina hoa aina o Hawaii nei. Ina hoa moana o manui a kea. Ina hoa honua o kia mokunui o Earth. Happy Earth Day, everybody. Woo! It's a beautiful planet. It's always nice to celebrate. Mahalo for coming out for this talk. I think most of you know I was supposed to give this talk on some random day back in March, but they shut down campus because of all the flooding. Apparently some other than human force really wanted me to present this on Earth Day. So here I am. Okay, so my ultimate goal with this talk is to build a tower of evidence-based hope upon which we can all peer into an optimistic future together. But in order for me to do that, I need to set a foundation for that tower to stand on. So I'll start out by laying that groundwork. It'll take some time. And it might get a little arduous, but in the end, I think you'll understand why I needed to spend so much time on setting that foundation. So let's get into it. The singularity, originally described by I.J. Good in 1965, is the hypothetical point in time at which technology advances beyond human control. With the latest advancements in AI over the past few months, the singularity has been a hot topic. Are we at that point? Are we past that point? There's a hot debate going on right now on the interweb right now, but that singularity is not the singularity that I'll be speaking about today. Instead, I'll be speaking about the original singularity, that point in time in which humans saw themselves as one with nature, a worldview that allowed them to build eco-civilizations like the one that existed here in Hawaii, and how a return to that worldview can lay a foundation for humanity to build a global eco-civilization. So the stories we tell matter. This is kind of the dominant narrative on the planet right now. The world is going to hell in a handbasket, and it's a bloodied hand of man that's taking it there. The narrative of humans destroying the planet is not only shaped by, but is also reinforced by an echo chamber in science that leverages a disproportionate amount of its applied research in two directions. One, highlighting the plethora of ways in which humans can be destructive to the environment, and two, showing how amazing nature can be when there are no humans around. There's actually a third line of research that could shatter this echo chamber, and it happens to be the line of research that I focus on. However, it's one that's under-supported by the academy. But I'll get to focus on that a little bit later. Nonetheless, with the dominant story about our impact on the world being what it is, it's easy to feel hopeless about our future. And this is maybe what some of us see. Any Star Wars fans in the audience? Oh, come on. Any Star Wars fans in the audience? Woo! All right, so you guys will know this is Coruscant. It's the capital planet. Oh, look at all those people. It's the capital planet of formerly the Galactic Republic, and then it turned into the Galactic Empire. Anyway, so some of us, this is what we see for the future of our planet. Yeah, but I'd like to think there's another future for our planet. Come inside, everybody. There's food. So the dominant story of our impacts on this planet make this future seem inevitable. My point is the story that we tell inspires how we care for or how we stop caring for our planet. However, while most of us assume the story is grounded in science, I'm here to tell you that it isn't. But rather, it's grounded in a series of myths that have been passed off as science. So my life's goal is to use science to dismantle these myths and show us that there's another pathway forward. So I'm going to get into it. Myth number one, humans are separate from nature. So where does this even come from? I think a lot of us in this room might agree that it sources back to the Christian Bible, which itself shaped the European Renaissance, an era that ushered in the age of enlightenment or the age of reason. This is when European philosophers like Sir Francis Bacon, Immanuel Kant, and others shaped the neoclassical worldview that we're all living within the context of today, whether we like it or not. But the idea that humans are separate from nature is not universally held across humanity. Rather, it's a social construct of the neoclassical worldview that was born in Europe in the 1700s. And it's an idea that has zero scientific foundation. So here's a scientific truth. Humans are a part of nature. If we're separate from anything, it's bacteria, because that stuff's way over there. I don't know what's going on, but the world that we see, the plants, the animals, the fungi, we're in that mix. Those are our relatives. And we're not even at the pinnacle. You know what's all the way at the pinnacle? Believe it or not, it's an opihi. That was a joke. It's not an OPE. Anyway, yeah, we're not even the pinnacle. We're just kind of in there. This certainly makes me question all of the science that was ever conducted based on that biased perspective that we are separate from nature. And I definitely question the validity of any scientific conclusion put forth in such studies. Myth number 2, humans are inevitable agents of ecocide. So I figured out there's actually a formula behind this myth. You take the silent spring and you add the overkill hypothesis and you multiply that by the tragedy of the commons, you get collapse. So what I'm saying is silent spring, I think maybe a book everybody in this audience probably knows, published in the 60s, which documented the very real negative impact that our modern living was having on biodiversity on the planet. If you don't know about it, go look it up. It's a cool book. But when that's added in with Martin's overkill hypothesis, that kind of gave us a picture of like, wow, we're causing extinctions today. But the overkill hypothesis made us think, wow, we've always caused extinctions. And then Harding comes in with his tragedy of commons, like, wow, we've done this everywhere. And that's where you get people like Jared Diamond writing this book, Collapse. I just want to point out that these things were published in Science, supposedly a top-end scientific journal, but these things have been refuted. There are multiple lines of research that have refuted the overkill hypothesis, and there's an entire pillar of academia that's been erected to show the falsehood of this tragedy of commons idea. So if these two things aren't true, then the idea that we are inevitably going to cause collapse on this planet is wrong. What's left is the very real understanding that we can cause a lot of damage. But it doesn't mean we always cause damage, doesn't mean we always have caused damage, doesn't mean we always will cause damage. So now I'm going to get into 3 examples of how this myth is played out in Hawaii. So it's going to take a bit, so please bear with me. Myth 2.1, Hawaiian sent birds to extinction. So here's the title of a 1982 paper, Fossil Birds of the Hawaiian Islands, Evidence for Wholesale Extinction by Hawaiians, basically. Evidence for wholesale extinction by Hawaiians. It was this seminal paper that was published in a well-respected journal, Science, that spawned the myth that Hawaiians hunted birds to extinction. And with the help of subsequent papers, these collectively shaped this narrative of Hawaii's ecological history, including what the Bishop Museum taught many of the thousands of school kids that went through there on field trips in the 80s, including this guy. So it was exactly 40 years ago. While I was on a field trip to the Bishop Museum in the 4th grade, when a scientist told me and my entire class about the amazing evolutionary diversity of Hawaii's birds. They then told us that sadly, most of them are extinct now, and explained to us it's because Hawaiians hunted them to extinction in a relentless pursuit of the feathers worn by the capes of the elite. As evidence for this narrative, they told us about the many capes that the museum had in its collection, one of them being Kamehameha's famous feather cape, which we were told more than 200,000 birds had to sacrifice their life to make. Now this story is problematic for several reasons, not the least of which is because it's entirely false. For one, it completely ignores the protocols of selective gathering that was employed by Hawaiian bird catchers, which limited the number of feathers that could be gathered from each bird before it was released back into the wild to continue its life in the forest. It also ignores the most important fact that these bird extinctions happened long after Hawaiians stopped making feather capes. But this story, they told us, did position conservationists as the saviors of Hawaiian forest birds. And it was very clear who the antagonist in this narrative was. It was us. I knew it in my na'au, in my gut, all the way back then, that this story I was being told was wrong. And when I look back on it, this is when my life's journey in science began. So the version of the story of Hawaiian bird extinctions that we were told in the museum that day was not a one-off event. Even after scientists discovered the real cause of those extinctions were 2 mosquito-borne diseases to which our birds had no immunity, that version of the story that blamed extinctions on Hawaiians has been a favorite of American conservationists, especially the ones working in Hawaii. But as far as I can tell, until very recently, these conservationists never even bothered to ask what the Native Hawaiian perspective was at that time of these extinctions. I guess it was assumed that either Hawaiians didn't know or didn't care that these birds are going extinct. So, what I'm about to share is not the common narrative in the conservation community in Hawaii. The truth is that Hawaiians have always lamented the loss of native birds. As just one example, here's an article from a Hawaiian language newspaper, Kawika, in 1871, lamenting the disappearance of native birds from Manoa Valley here, just above the university. It was penned by T.N. Penukahi, entitled He mau kama'aina no ka'ua tuahine ua nalavali, which means the residents of the famous range in the back of the valley, the Tuahine Range, have disappeared. So in there, this is what Penukahi said. Oia ho'i ke ia, o na wahi manu kama'aina o kumako uka nei, o ka iwi, o ka o'u, o ka akakani, o ka o'oloma'o, o ka elepaio, o lako na manu kama'aina o ke ia ua pau I ka nalavali. So he's naming these birds and he's saying they're gone. In this article, Penukahi listed these 6 bird species that have disappeared from the valley and went on to describe that it had been at least 10 years since they had heard these birds in the valley. Penukahi even speculated that the disappearance of these native birds might be linked to the introduction of foreign birds. Penukahi noted the parallels between the decimation of the native Hawaiian population and the introduction of non-native birds. Penukahi noted the parallels between the foreigners that came to Hawaii and the diseases they brought, which caused decimation to the native Hawaiian population, and the introduction of these non-native birds and the disappearance of our native birds. The implications were clear. And it seems that Hawaiians had an idea about what was really happening to our native birds more than a century before American conservationists figured it out. So imagine what would have happened if conservation biologists listened to 19th century Hawaiians instead of blaming them. And some of you might be thinking, well, what about the Moanalo? Didn't the Hawaiians kill them off pretty quickly? Well, let me just start with that word, Moanalo. It's a made-up Hawaiian word. It's tantamount to a culturally appropriated neologism that gives the impression that there was an overlap between the existence of this extinct bird and the initial settlement of Polynesians. Not a Hawaiian word. But in order for me to answer this question, I need to briefly explain something about the interpretation of data. So in the biological sciences, we're taught that there's a difference between correlation and causation. So in case there are some other than scientists in the crowd, it's important to understand that correlation does not equal causation. So I have a little fun little graphic that helps explain this. So you can see the number of Nicolas Cage movies and the number of pool drownings. So if you just looked at correlations, you would tell your kids, don't ever go next to Nicolas Cage. But we know that he's not murdering kids. This is just a correlation. There's no causal link, right? So now, I don't know if they don't teach this in archaeology or if that wasn't a thing for them in the 80s, but what those archaeology papers that in the 80s that blamed Hawaiians for extinctions based their conclusions on correlations, not causations. They saw that in the deeper layers, there were lots of birds and no humans. Then they noticed those same birds were absent in the human layers. That's correlative evidence. What they didn't see was causal evidence for human-driven extinctions, not even evidence of hunting. There were no extinct bird bones in middens, no charred bones from extinct species because of cooking, no cut bones. They just saw no birds. And their conclusion, Hawaiians hunted birds to extinction. A highly problematic conclusion from a scientific perspective, if you ask me. But regardless, this narrative was set in the 80s and it remains a part of the mythology that exists in conservation to this very day. So these myths have impacted not only contemporary waterbird conservation efforts, but our attempts to publish research on waterbirds. So I'm just going to share with you a little story. As a part of my day job, I'm involved in endangered waterbird research in He'eia. A few years ago, after formally documenting that lo'i, or wetland agroecosystems, provide nesting habitat for these birds, we were interested to know how if we did a full restoration of all the lo'i in all of Hawaii, how that might contribute to a recovery of these birds. So enter Melissa Price and Kristen Harmon, stage left. Melissa Price is the PI of the Wildlife Ecology Lab here on campus. Kristen Harmon was a student of hers at the time. And so, and I got invited to be on the committee, and we said, hey, how's about one of your chapters, you could do a GIS modeling exercise, just see what happens if we restored all of the lo'i lands, how that might contribute to recovery of these endangered water birds. So she did all that work, did the GIS, got some amazing numbers, and we sent it out to publication. And guess what? It got rejected. It got rejected because this isn't an exact quote, but something to the effect of, it's common knowledge that Hawaiians caused extinctions of water birds. So the idea that looking to Hawaiian practices to assist in their recovery is absolutely preposterous. This should not be published. I recommend rejection. And the editor agreed, rejected. So then there was a shock. It wasn't a shock to me. I kind of knew that was going to happen, but it was a shock to Kristen. She's not from here. She's like, what's up with this whole thing of everybody thinks Hawaiians cause bird extinctions? I said, I don't know. It's a thing. As far as I know, there's zero evidence of it, but you know what? That should be another chapter in your dissertation. Why don't you go do a full synthesis of all the archaeological papers ever published in Hawaii having to do with birds, and tell me if there's any evidence of even any hunting. And she went and did the work. And guess what? Zero evidence. Zero evidence of Hawaiians hunting birds. So where did this even come from? So anyway, she wrote the chapter. We sent it off for publication eventually. Guess what? Rejected. So that one got rejected because, again, not exact quote, but something to the effect of, oh yeah, we sent it off saying, you know, we're debunking the myth of Hawaiians causing bird extinctions. And so one of the comments of one of the reviewers was, while this paper attempts to debunk the so-called myth of Hawaiians causing bird extinctions, they do so by elevating the myth of the noble savage. They actually said that. So it's not the first time I've been accused of elevating the noble savage myth, but they recommended rejection and it was rejected. So then like, what are we gonna do? And I said, Christian said, what are we gonna do, Kawika? I said, okay, what we need is we need a figure. We need a figure that clearly lays out all of the birds, all the water birds that have ever existed in Hawaii to our knowledge, when they went extinct. And let's show them that there's a correlation between a regime shift, which is basically this major shift in the climate that induces a major shift in the vegetation. So if you don't know what an ecological regime shift is, it's basically like a political regime shift. You take the dominant pieces of the system, you throw those away, you replace them with other dominant things, and there's a cascading effect. So in ecology, part of that cascading effect is extinctions. And if you look, after every single regime shift, there's a cascading effect of extinctions. Now, some of these later ones, part of the regime shift was introduce things in that, but there have always been extinctions after regime shifts in Hawaii. But you know what? All those extinctions is what people were blaming on Native Hawaiians, even though that was way before anybody showed up here. So anyway, because we did this figure, we finally got it published. That was back in January. And now we have some solid scientific literature out there refuting this myth. You guys can clap. All right, thanks. Okay, myth 2.2. Hawaiians cause deforestation by slash and burn agriculture. Okay, I'm going to read this abstract. Not supposed to do that, but this is important. Evidence obtained from archaeological and ancillary studies of paleo environment suggests that the prehistoric Polynesians had a far greater impact on the Hawaiian ecosystem than has heretofore been realized. Such impact by the introduction by Polynesians of exotic plants and animals, the cumulative effects of forest clearance and habitat modification through the use of fire led to major changes in lowland ecology. Among the consequences of this transformation of the Hawaiian landscape were the extinction of endemic species, alteration of vegetative communities, and erosion. I mean, it sounds reasonable. I'm being honest, I mean, kind of makes sense. You guys sound smart. And for American conservationists, they thought so too, because this is a story that they echoed for decades. There's only one problem with this story. it also doesn't seem to be true. What is true, to the contrary, ancient Hawaiians employed a highly sophisticated system of resource management that we've articulated as a moku system. There were many different kinds of forest types that were identified by name and taken care of in all of these things. And it's hard to imagine how when you have a system like this, you have deforestation. But I'm not the only one who thinks like this. So in 2018, Sam Gon and some colleagues published their model of the ecological footprint of Hawaiian society as compared to our modern footprint. In the upper half of this figure, which depicts the Hawaiian footprint, reveals that only 14% of native habitat was altered in support of a population of 1 million Hawaiians. And really a lot of that was just conversion of forest to wetlands. So it wasn't habitat destruction, it was habitat conversion. Whereas if you look at the bottom, you're looking at full habitat destruction over there, including the massive deforestation that happened in the post-contact period. This is the deforestation that Hawaiians were paying for. Yeah. So here's a historical truth. Massive deforestation didn't happen in Hawaii until the 1800s. This is because commercial logging for fine cabinetry and firewood for all these steam engines that were shipping sugarcane around the islands, industrial agriculture, plantations, ranch lands, invasive ungulates being cattle and goats. But somehow by the late 20th century, that story of American conservationists told blamed all this deforestation on Native Hawaiians. But just in case you don't believe me, here's a first-hand account from 1882, written by a graduate of the esteemed Punahou School. For those of you who might not be familiar with Punahou School, it's very prestigious. It's where President Barack Obama graduated. It's where Senator Brian Schatz graduated. All of the Rapoons in Waiahole. Couldn't help it. I love you guys. But anyway, thanks to Ivani Kyoki Carter for helping share this reference with me, but I'll just read it. But who has not lived here for 25 years or less has not observed the immense destruction that has taken place in our limited forests. When the writer of this first began to attend Punahou School in 1860, water flowed year-round. The lands were covered in dense forest growth, a wealth of the richest vegetation. Contrast that with today, the valleys and hillsides are almost completely denuded of trees, the waterways dry and rocky. Who does not remember Waimea on Hawaii Island of old and the Waimea today? The vast forest which stretched its unbroken wall of green from far atop the sides of Mauna Kea across the valley and over to the Kohala Mountain into Kohala, a windbreak for the verdant plains of Waimea is gone. Maui, Kauai, Molokai, Lanai are equal sufferers. Kohalave is sometimes looked upon as past recovery. The cause of this change and destruction have been largely under the control of man because they have been unchecked and disregarded the ruin that has gone fiercely along. First-hand account of deforestation in the 1800s. Myth 2.3, Hawaiians overexploited coral reefs. So again, some of those archaeologists digging through middens, if you don't know what a midden is basically an ancient garbage pile, finding that there's decreasing fish bones through time and interpreting that as meaning, oh, this is the point at which Hawaiians started overexploiting the reefs. But people like me have been saying for a long time that the decreasing size of fish bones and middens is more likely due to a shift towards more sustainable fishing strategies than it is evidence of overexploitation of fisheries. But it wasn't until very recently that I started to work with some computational modelers who could help me work through all the crazy math to demonstrate what we've been talking about all along. I don't have time to get into the details, but in short, thanks to Lisa McManus, a colleague of mine at HIMB, and one of our PhD students, Sophia Ranke, we now have mathematical modeling of Hawaiian fisheries management practices that shows how trophic management of predators, coupled with a shift in a reliance on smaller fishes and harvest closures that are aligned with spawning periods, could result in increased productivity of our reefs, pictured here. And these sustainable fisheries that relied on smaller fishes, in turn help to support a growing human population. I should also add that there have been many Native Hawaiian accounts of fisheries collapse that also, just like the deforestation, happened in the 1800s. So those last three were all about Hawaii-based examples of a larger myth about how humans are destroying the environment for humans always destroy the environment as soon as they show up. And I have shown how the environmental destruction we are dealing with today was not done by the hands of indigenous people, but rather was a part of the tragedy of colonization. And now we're going to get back to the third myth that has shaped our current understanding of the world. So myth number 3, science originated in the European Age of Enlightenment. Now this is a big one. I don't have time today to dismantle that properly. So I'll just go ahead and jump to the local example of this myth, which is 3.1, the myth of British discovery. So I'm at an age where it was literally in our textbooks that Captain Cook discovered Hawaii. And yes, it's so that's one. And then another one that I hear a lot nowadays still is that the British discovered oceanography and marine biology. And they say that the HMS Challenger expedition in the 1800s was the very origin of these disciplines. And yes, it's true, the naturalists aboard the Challenger studied the dynamics of the ocean, and they named and classified the fishes therein. However, they weren't the first people to do this. And on top of that, the naturalists aboard the Challenger described our ancestors as ignorant savages, and they stole skulls out of burials in a vain attempt to prove our inferiority through the pseudoscience of phrenology. So I refuse to credit these people as the first marine biologists. So if you add it all up, you get to one myth that rules them all, which is kind of saying the quiet part out loud. That science and conservation did not exist in Hawaii until Europeans and Americans came here and taught these concepts to us. Now, to be fair, I can't recall anybody ever saying these words out loud, but it was certainly the implication of what was being taught to us when we went on those field trips to the Bishop Museum in the 1980s. And it underlined what was taught to us in conservation biology classes on this campus in the 90s. So I just have one thing to say to this. So the true story of discovery in the Pacific is that our Austronesian ancestors married the very ancient knowledge system of celestial navigation with what was then a new seafaring technology, and over the course of 3,000 years, developed and perfected a method of oceanic wayfinding that allowed them to discover the most remote ocean islands in the world a millennia before Europeans even ventured away from their shores. In truth, our Pacific Island ancestors were the first people to study the dynamics of the ocean. They were the first people to name the fish species in the Pacific, and they were the first people to classify these species within knowledge systems. Now, they didn't do it in the context of the English language, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't be credited as the first oceanographers and the first marine biologists. If anyone gets that credit, it's our Pacific Island ancestors. So yes, our ancestors were scientists, and we are still blessed to have the keepers of indigenous science among us today. The greatest scientist I know is Uncle Mac Poi Poi. He lives on Molokai, and he's actively teaching the younger generations of Hawaiians how to build knowledge through the methodologies of indigenous science. So I should say, when we speak about science, we're not always talking about the same thing. When academics talk about science, they're usually referring to the institution of science, the capital S science, which is a pillar of the ivory tower, a culture in and of itself. It likes to position itself as a preeminent knowledge system. It's designed to reinforce the existing power structures within academia, and it's the science of privilege. The first ones have been published, the last one is mine. When I'm talking about indigenous science, I'm referring to a process of building knowledge by engaging in the scientific method within the context of indigenous epistemologies. And the indigenous science, that indigenous science is more aligned with this other sense of science over here on the right, lowercase s science, which is a process of building knowledge. It's a part of various cultures and societies around the world. It's held in parity with other pathways for building knowledge, like spirituality. It's designed to solve problems. And this last one is mine, the science of necessity. So if all that seems a bit hyperbolic for you, let me give you a tangible example. Lokoi'a. Our indigenous aquaculture systems in Hawaii that are colloquially referred to as fish ponds here in Hawaii, to me at least, are the quintessential example of indigenous science. Pictured here is He'eia fish pond. So Hawaiian aquaculture systems are unique. These approaches to aquaculture are certainly found nowhere else in the Pacific and probably not in the world. So we know these large-scale systems were a novel technology that was developed here in Hawaii. And the archaeological record points to time about 800 years ago when these were constructed. There was a period where there was none, and about 100 years after that, or about a century after that, there are 100 or so of these large-scale systems throughout the main Hawaiian Islands. This represents a rapid dissemination of new knowledge throughout the entire archipelago, and that embodies the last step in the scientific process. So what about those first steps in the scientific process that were used to build this body of knowledge that was so rapidly disseminated? Well, there's some other of the older stories from the island of Molokai that speak about tracing back, all of this tracing back anciently to generations of observations of the migratory and spawning patterns of fishes, coupled with the knowledge of environmental parameters in coastal waters, which in turn led to ideas of habitat augmentation that would allow reefs to produce even more fish than they could alone. I honestly can't imagine how any of this could have been developed without indigenous science. So now, to be fair, like I said earlier, while that quiet part out loud has implications about what Hawaiians did, and that they didn't have a conservation ethic, and that was dominant in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. This narrative has morphed a bit in the last couple decades. It's actually maybe the last 10 or 15 years. I've increasingly heard a kinder and gentler version of this myth, which is maybe Hawaiians eventually developed a conservation ethic. That was only after learning some major lessons born out of catastrophic mistakes. The problem with this idea is that it's predicated on one of two notions. Either one, the Pacific Islanders somehow did not develop any conservation ethics or practices in the 3,000 years of living in island systems before they arrived here, or the first voyagers here somehow left their 3,000-year-old indigenous solid systems behind when they got on their canoes. I think both those assumptions are absolutely ridiculous, but this is not just an opinion. There is evidence that the founders brought with them a stewardship toolkit that was imbued with indigenous knowledge when they left their ancestral homelands, and that they used this toolkit when they arrived here 1,000 years ago. But in a truly transdisciplinary study that I'm working on in collaboration with some colleagues from the Center for Pacific Island Studies, the William S. Richardson School of Law, and the Kamakukuokalani Center for Hawaiian Studies, we are currently finalizing a manuscript that will refute this notion that Hawaiians only came upon conservation in a reaction to catastrophic mistakes in resource management. This research basically provides evidence for what we are calling the Polynesian Stewardship Toolkit that is shaped by a future-oriented abundance mindset. I don't have time to get into all the details right now, but I will point out some of its main features. Namely, that they're relating to the conservation, there are three kinds of kapu. You can bin them in permanent ones, like our wawakua, our sacred forest. It's always wawakua, it's never not wawakua, it's kapu. There are also seasonal kapus, like with the spawning of fishes. It happens like clockwork. Every time you know it's kapu. But then there's another kind of kapu. It's an adaptive management, using the terminology of today, kind of kapu. Maybe a thing can be good for 100 years, but all of a sudden, its abundance collapses a little bit, and there's a tool that allows you to put a kapu on that so that it can recover. And that's called lahui. So for most of us who grew up in Hawaii, lahui means something else. It means nation or race, and that's true. But that's the first definition listed in the dictionary. But Hawaiian words are polysemous, as I learned from my friend Alex over here, meaning that a single word can have multiple meanings. And if you read down in the dictionary, you'll see that under the third definition, lahui means to prohibit, forbid, lea, taboo, proclaim a law. And as it turns out, this sense of lahui is a cognate for rahui or ra'ui, which is a kapu-based practice found all throughout Eastern Polynesia. Rahui declaration can be used in several ways, but one of the main ones is to close a resource species or a resource space from harvesting until a point in the time in the future when it's abundant again. So in our paper, we take a deeper look at where this word actually came from. So don't worry, I'm not going to get too deep into linguistics. You can ask Alex all about this after the seminar. But I do want to, our research shows that Lahui is just one cognate in the Rahui complex that exists in at least 10 Eastern Polynesian languages, and has been transported in deep time across vast expansions of ocean space. And this research provides some pretty solid evidence that the idea that the first Polynesians who arrived here in these islands carried with them science-based conservation tools. You know, it's actually really hard for me to reconcile the idea that the people who have a worldview built on an abundance mindset, which was reinforced through a culture of conservation that was ever focused on the well-being of future generations, as evidenced by the Rahui complex, could have ever caused deforestation and wholesale mass extinctions. So as I pointed out earlier, a closer look at the evidence shows that they actually didn't. So stay tuned for more when that paper actually comes out, hopefully some point this year. So anyway, what does this all mean? Well, the big picture is that the dominant stories that have shaped conservation efforts in Hawaii are myths based on social constructs, not science. And they have heretofore obstructed our view of another path forward. But now that these myths are debunked, what we're left with is indigenous eco-civilizations as the best model for humans and nature to thrive together in a single system. Okay, now's the good part. That was just the foundation. Okay, so I refer to ancient Hawaiian society as a civilization because that's what it was by any definition of a civilization. It was a highly structured society with a multi-tiered governing system where knowledge and arts flourished, with a large population of over 1 million people that was sustained and supported by technological advances in food production and so on and so forth. Checked all the boxes. Now I call it an eco-civilization because unlike the civilizations that we all learned about in middle school, they achieved all this by maintaining rather than destroying the habitat types that supported its existence in the first place, like forests and wetlands. And their ability to achieve technological advancements in food production while maintaining forests and wetlands came from developing these technologies through various forms of ecomimicry. So ecomimicry is basically a method of resource production that is facilitated by harnessing existing ecological processes rather than destroying those and replacing them with artificially supported systems of agriculture. And ecomimicry is the foundation for the Hawaiian concept of aina momona, which is a state of sustainable resource abundance that exists when the amount of food the system produces exceeds the needs of the people. Back in 2020, we articulated all of this in quite a bit of detail and described 8 different forms of ecomimicry. But while the examples we provided in that article were from the Hawaiian eco-civilization, these forms of ecomimicry were used in other eco-civilizations of the past in other places around the world. So the same approaches that were used to set the foundation for the Hawaiian eco-civilization are now being used to heal Hawaii. Because if ecomimicry could sustainably support a population of more than 1 million people back in Hawaii 300 years ago, then it can do so again today. As is reflected in this Hawaiian proverb, our future is in our past. But this also has real implications for the future of our planet. Okay, Star Wars fans. And speaking of the future, Star Wars was nice enough to give us an image of other space-age civilizations, including this one that existed on a forested planet. This image always gave me a new hope. All right. Could Earth look like this one day? Maybe, but how can we get from where we are today on a planet with decreasing forests to living on a forest-covered planet in the space age? Well, this is where indigenous wisdom comes in. So here's Hokule'a. I hope everybody knows Hokule'a's story. There are many great teachings of this canoe, and one of them, I'm just gonna pick one of them, is the saying, Hemoku hewa'a hewa'a hemoku, which was the theme, I think, of its 2016 worldwide voyage. What this means is a canoe is an island is a canoe. So there's this way of thinking of when you have limited resources, like when you're on a canoe, When you get off that canoe and get onto the island, it's just a bigger canoe. You still have limited resources. So if you're gonna, the difference between surviving and thriving is recognizing how to harness those limited resources into abundance. And that's all encapsulated in this proverb. Another lesson that Hokulea teaches us is that if you want to change your destination, just navigate by a different star. Okay, so we need to navigate by a different star. If this is a trajectory that we're on right now on our planet, then Hokulea teaches it that we can navigate by a different star. And on top of that, we need to be better humans. We need to be better humans. So luckily, I know a guy who has a few things to say about that. So these are the teachings, just one little nugget of some of the teachings of Gandhi. I'm going to click through them and do it slowly because I really want us to internalize these teachings and start to think, wow, maybe this is why we're not living so right in the world right now. Wealth without work. Pleasure without conscience. Knowledge without character. Commerce without morality. Science without humanity. Worship without sacrifice. And politics without principle. I'm just gonna leave that right there. But this is a great place to start understanding how we can be better. But as amazing as this teaching is, Gandhi lived like 100 years ago, right? And the world is a different place now. To me, these all still hold true, but I also think there's another sin that has emerged in the last 50 years that has been operating to the detriment of society. And that brings me to the 8th social sin, which I contend is triangulated between 3 ideas that I've talked around a bit so far this year. Today. The first being colonization, which has resulted in severed relationships between indigenous peoples and our lands and waters, and the biodiversity that shaped the languages and the lifeways of our ancestors. 2, being the neoclassical worldview, which has been built around this unscientific social construct that humans are separate from nature. And 3, being the imposition of this worldview on indigenous peoples in the name of wildlife conservation. So when conservation efforts are predicated on the severed relationship between humans and the rest of nature, conservation is employing the same tools that campaigns of colonization did for centuries in the past. And by doing so, conservation efforts can perpetuate social injustices against indigenous peoples and exacerbate the intergenerational traumas that were caused by colonization in the first place. And it keeps the idea of building a global eco-civilization relegated to the minds of dreamers like me. So in reality, or relationality, we'll see these things not as Hawaiian wildlife, but as Hawaiian elder life. So we can design conservation programs founded on the notion of caring for our elder life. And this is some of what the concept of biocultural restoration is about. As the Hawaiian historian David Malo wrote in 1838, when an island has people living on it, it's called Aina. Aina encapsulates a human in nature epistemology that, as we described in this 2021 paper, is a foundation of stewardship, caretakership, and guardianship that exists as different forms of indigenous agency in Hawaii. It is also the foundation for Aina Momona and the framework that we have been using for biocultural restoration efforts here. But what is biocultural restoration? Well, if as I described earlier, you think of colonization as a process that results in severing relationships between indigenous people and their lands and waters and their ancestral languages, lifeways, so on and so forth, then you can think of biocultural restoration as the antidote. As I described back in 2021, Biocultural restoration focuses on restoring the relationships between indigenous people and their places, as well as between them and the biodiversity shaped the languages and identities of the ancestors. Biocultural restoration is built on the notion that everything in this system is interconnected, as are the problems we perceive and the solutions to them. But after a few years of presenting this very slide, I started to notice that by describing it in this way, I was starting to lose the non-Indigenous people in the audience. I would frequently get the question, well, I'm not Indigenous, so what does this mean for me? They wanted to see themselves as a part of the biocultural restoration efforts, but they couldn't because of the way I was framing it. But then I had an epiphany, actually last semester. There's when a non-Indigenous student in my class shared about the solastalgia that he felt when the fireflies disappeared from his backyard in the area, when the area he was growing up in was starting to get urbanized over on the continent. Solastalgia can be described as the despair that one feels at the loss of nature. And that's when it hit me. The pain that's caused when our relationships to the rest of nature are severed is very much a major part of our modern human experience. It happens to all of us, whether or not we identify as Indigenous. So I'm gonna put it another way. You guys all remember this logic when we're studying for SATs, is to B is equals to D, hopefully. Okay, so this is where I'm thinking. Colonization is to Indigenous people as urbanization is to humanity. You can debate me on this later, but I'm kind of thinking this is a thing. So I started thinking, wow, solastalgia can actually be measured on a pain scale. And if we can all agree colonization is 11, then maybe what my student was feeling when those fireflies disappeared, or maybe a 5, maybe a 6. 6. Okay. So if biocultural restoration is the antidote to colonization for Indigenous people, then it's also the cure for the solastalgia that is being experienced by humanity writ large. And this is how the biocultural approaches we have been developing here in Hawaii connect to a larger global issue. So Aina Momona is a framework. We need to build a global eco-civilization and achieve the biocultural singularity. Because if the only humans who engage in biocultural restoration are Indigenous people, then it will always only ever be the minority of us who are living right by our planet, while the rest of the world chugs into a dystopian future, bringing us along with them. But in order for the majority of humanity to embrace this, we need to do good science. I don't just mean robust science. I mean science that does good in the world, the kind that Gandhi talked about, science with humanity. And if we don't narrowly constrain our scientific research to demonstrating how humans are bad for nature, or showing how amazing nature is when there are no people around, and engaging more expansively in science by focusing our research on biocultural studies that help us to understand how amazing nature can be when there are people around, and then incorporating the results of those studies into the design of our modern society, then we have a chance. You know, now that I think about it, I think there might be a formula for this. So I've discovered there's a formula for the biocultural singularity, where humans and nature thrive together. So you take the concept of Aina Momona, the idea that we can steward our places to be more abundant than they were before we showed up. You multiply that by Okawa Mamua, Okawa Mahope, knowing that we've supported this population in the past, we can do it again in the future. You multiply that by Hewa'a, Hemoku, Hemoku, Hewa'a, recognizing that we have limited resources, but we can still create an abundance mindset within that context. And then you divide that by Silent Spring, which is a very real knowledge of the real potential of the negative impacts on the planet that we can do. Yeah. What this means is that the downward trajectory towards a dystopian future that humanity is currently on is not an inevitability. By learning from Indigenous wisdom, we can get back to a place where the human civilization is thriving on a forested planet that has abundant oceans. You know, several of the elders I learned from, and many of the elders before them, have said that Hawaii can heal the world. Hawaii can heal the world. Now, a lot of what they were talking about was the spirit of aloha. Any of us who have traveled outside of Hawaii know what that's like. But it was also about the wisdom that's held in our aina, a wisdom that can teach us about how humans and nature can thrive together. And that is why Hawaii can provide the template for building a global eco-civilization. In the words of the prophecy of Paku'i, Ho'ale Kalepo Popo. Mahalo.
Mahalo, Kawika. I'll take questions from the audience.
Any questions?
Or from online as well. Online, if you want to unmute and ask your question, otherwise feel free to put it in the chat.
Oh, yes. Kelsey, is a question from you or online?
Oh, I have a question.
Oh.
On the Rahui slide, what did the purple and green colors mean, and why was there a gap between?
Oh boy. Okay. So she's asking to repeat the question is on the Rahui slide. We were talking about how the Rahui complex exists in 10 languages across Eastern Polynesia, and we're tracing the linguistic roots of this word. So try not to get too deeply into it, but the linguists in the room will tell you that there's a way to trace back words through time. And even in the dictionaries that are have been written by native speakers, have said that it seems to trace back to a Proto-Polynesian word, lafu, that has shifted over time. There's been, it started out as this idea of grouping, and then over time picked up another sense of this kapu-based practice that I was talking about earlier. And then in some places in Eastern Polynesia, both those senses of the words are still retained, and other places have lost them. So the ones that are only purple, they've kind of, based on the evidence we've seen, they've lost this sense of Rahui as a grouping, and they've kept the sense of Rahui as a kapu. Hawaii is one of those places that had both. It's probably this synergistic relationship between these two senses that provided the foundation for this, for in Hawaii to take on a third sense of being Lahui, being the nation. It's a grouping of people that are self-governing for abundance, taking care of themselves, which is what the kapu practice is all about. So, anything to add, Alex?
Okay, glad to talk after.
Yeah, Alex always loves that. Any other questions?
Where do you think the fish ponding concept started, and why didn't it flow back south?
Oh, that's a really good question. So the question is, where did the fish pond technology start? And then why didn't it flow back south? So that's a really good question. I'm not sure why it went back south. I'm assuming it's because, and I haven't really looked into this, but my first initial thought is maybe it happened after the navigation back and forth stopped, because it stopped for a time. And like I said earlier on that slide, I mean, there's a lot of different stories about the origins of these things. But as my friend Malia Okutagawa shared, some of the older stories on Molokai, just like I said in the side, is based on ancestral observations of watching the fish migrations, where they spawn, where the baby fish always are. Probably had something to do with, you know, this future-oriented abundance mindset. You're always not just trying to eat today, but you're trying to make sure you have fish for your grandchildren. So if you can protect those baby fish, your grandchildren can have fish, kind of thing. And then probably, you know, iterative adaptation, that's the scientific process into developing the various forms of that technology that we have today. It's a guess. Any other questions?
Thank you. Really enjoyed the talk. I had a question about a concept that I think, excuse me, I kept thinking about during the talk, but didn't hear you talk about too much, and that's
capitalism. And so I'm curious about where you're thinking about the relationship between capitalism and, you know, the discussions that you're having about land and restoration.
Yeah, great. That's a great question. The question's about capitalism and a keen observation that I didn't talk about capitalism much in my talk. So I guess there's a lot of people who will talk about the ills of capitalism, much of which I agree with, but I'm not sure that capitalism is inherently bad. I think the way capitalism is manifest now is a lot of negative things. So in another realm of research and some collaborations that I have with folks like Kamana Maitolani Beamer, who talk a lot about the circular economy, we talk about indigenizing the circular economy, we talk about recognizing that the system that the kupuna had in the old days was based on economic theory. They didn't have dollars, but they had fishes. Like nowadays, we're rich if we have a lot of dollars in our bank account. Back then, they were rich if they had a lot of fish in their ahupa'a. So it's this idea of abundance mindset. Aina Momona is making sure it's something like investing money. If for those of you who invest money or know anything about that, you invest money, that's your corpus. You live off the interest on top. The dumbest thing you can ever do is take out of your corpus. You live off the interest. That's the smartest thing you can do. That's basically what the kupuna did. They didn't take out of the corpus of the reefs. They built abundance on top of that and lived off the abundance as living off the biological interests of the reef. So in that sense, like the old Hawaiians would say, we're just living off the fat of the land. Translated into ecology speak, they're not taking away from the ecological corpus that was here when they arrived. They've built abundance on top of that, and that's what's sustaining them. That's economic theory. So I think if we can indigenize how we're engaging capitalism to be circular, informed by indigenous values, then maybe capitalism can actually do some good on this world. Great, sorry.
Yeah, thanks so much. I have to get out more because this is the best talk I've heard in a long time. I'm so glad I came today. I felt like I was with you all the way until urbanization, and I'd be the last person to argue for more urbanization. But just to play devil's advocate,
Oh, please.
it seems like some people have argued that smarter urbanization may be a way to save our planet, given the increasing population. We need some way to do that smartly and maintain our relationship with nature. So I'm not advocating for that position. I'm just saying there are people out there that might see urbanization as a solution. And I'm just wondering.
Talk about urbanizing in a smarter way. I'm so close. Okay, there it is. So if people couldn't hear the questions about urbanization and pointing out that there are many scholars and dynamic thinkers who are saying there's a better way to urbanize. Sure, there is a better way to urbanize. I think living in cities is inherently unsustainable no matter what you do. You can be a little bit better, but you can't have, I don't see how you can have that much humans in one place and be sustainable. You look at Hawaiian society 300 years ago, 1 million people, there were no cities. Everybody was dispersed throughout the landscape. You had population centers, but no cities. Your population was limited by what your ahupa could feed. So, there's definitely better ways we can build urban environments, but I think we shouldn't put all our eggs in the basket of how super cities are going to be less bad. There's a lot of room to grow in our rural places, our communities that can be living in closer relationship with everything around them, building abundance. If we can just take down these barriers that you're not allowed to mess with nature because that's separate from you. So, good question. There's one in the back.
It was close to it. I was just curious if you could define urbanism more broadly, because it seems like it is largely that density distinction, and then the map of interference that you showed in indigenous Hawaii versus modern Hawaii, like there's more interference, right? In modern Hawaii, we've disrupted greater swaths of land. So in one interpretation of that, Hawaiians lived in like more concentrated coastal communities compared to our development of housing stock now, which I think lots of people would describe as urbanism. So
yes.
Yeah.
So questions more. Another question about urbanism. It's getting a little bit outside of my realm of expertise. I definitely have lots of thoughts on it. I think part of indigenizing means decentralizing. When we have a centralized distribution system for food, water, energy, this is what Hawaii today is what we get. One of the things that we can learn from, if we didn't decentralize that, if we had all of our communities producing their own food, their own energy, this and that, it would be a different Hawaii. So there's a lot of policy barriers in the way of that, but the Institution for Sustainability Research is going to dismantle those barriers. Right, McKenna?
Was the urban planning professor? Brian's on there too, so there's two of us. I do feel the need to say there is a vast literature, really, one, but doing urbanism better, but also saying the way that urbanism fits into the whole system, right? And so when you look at like per capita indicators of resource use, urban spaces often have much better metrics, right? And so it's not a one size fits all, I think. I'm just gonna leave it there.
No, I
Come hang out with
there's
us.
no silver bullet. I think the point is we can all be better, whether it's an urban environment, rural environment. The more we're producing our own, that's a lower carbon footprint. It's better for the planet. You can do that in urban spaces and in rural spaces. Oh, question.
I think one thing I find interesting about the urbanization chats is how it shapes people's connection to Aina and to plants and nature even. And, you know, I guess that's part of what designing urban spaces better might get at. But what do you think would be important for fostering kind of connection in urban spaces?
Oh, so the question about what can be better to foster connection in urban spaces. You know, there's a really great paper written by some friends of mine called Urban Aina. It's a really good paper to look to. I had a student from Yale come through a few years back, and she was telling me the story about how at Yale for Indigenous Peoples Day, they all like threw a big powwow or something, and how it didn't really feel the best. I'm like, yeah, that's not what Indigenous Peoples Day should be about. It shouldn't be acting Indigenous for a day. It should be embracing values of relationality all around you. If you're living in New York, there's a tree on the corner. Talk to the tree. I don't know, build a relationship. It all starts somewhere. You can do it anywhere. Oh, Dean Fletcher.
We're leaving out the discussion of modern agriculture.
Oh,
which covers much more of global landscape than urbanized areas. And is in addition responsible for a lot of the pollution, as well as social injustice and other issues. But agriculture needs to be in that discussion as well when it comes to urbanization. Are you including or excluding?
Oh, that's a really good point. It should be included. So thank you for making that point. So if you didn't hear online, shout out to include industrial agriculture as something that induces soul nostalgia. Thanks, Chip. Oh, online.
We'll go to Athena first because she had her hand raised and then.
Sure. Mahalo, Dr. Winter, for this excellent talk. I really appreciate it. I wanted to ask because a lot of the myths about deforestation, over-extraction, etc., at the hands of Indigenous folks are pretty pervasive across Oceania. So, you know, you mentioned Collapse by Jared Diamond with that relief centers on Rapa Nui. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more to like partnerships or collaborations across Oceania to kind of uplift other communities that, yeah, as a Kanaka, I also firmly believe that Hawaii can be a model for the world. And also I'm thinking about our Pacifica siblings and the ways to kind of uplift other communities that maybe don't have the same research funding environment that we have access to in Hawaii. So just your thoughts on that. Mahalo.
Oh, that's a really good question too. Somewhat complex. So Bruno's in the room. He helped to coalesce a bunch of us at UH Manoa who are doing any kind of work across the Pacific. And it's a relatively new group, but through this convening, we were able to start having these conversations instead of us like writing a grant and doing some, there's people in the room like Tamar Kitkin, Leah Brammer, Rachel Dax is usually here, who do this amazing work in the Pacific. Instead of these being one-off things, how can we, through our network of researchers, leverage more and help to elevate these stories and dispel these myths of deforestation. yeah, hopefully that's a sufficient answer for now, but thank you for that question.
Online is from Deanna. Can you talk a little bit more about the sin of conservation without relationality? I know that you described it in many different ways, but if you were to summarize, what does conservation with relationality look like in the day-to-day sense?
I don't know, follow me around for a day. I think, like I said on that slide, it's what are we conserving? And what is our framework for engaging in that conservation? If, you know, okay, I'm sure a lot of us in this room saw My Octopus Teacher. And I was watching that Netflix, was it like a documentary or something? I was like, wow, this guy is really starting to get how we think. And then it got to the point where that octopus got attacked by the shark, and his initial emotional response was to go protect the octopus from the shark, but he stopped himself. He said, no, this is nature and I can't interfere. I'm like, no, you were so close, so close.
I'm sorry, I said that shark must have seen him. Also, so
No.
he already interfered.
So I think there's, for the sin of conservation is believing in this invisible line that's a social construct and not allowing yourself to care, not allowing to see yourself as a relative, saying that this is nature, this is a forest, this is not our place, this is the ocean, this is not our place. In conservation that's predicated on those severed relationships is what reinforces the trauma that we're all feeling. Everybody in this room is feeling that, has felt that. So that's why I say it's a sin and we need to stop doing it. Thanks, Diana.
Okay, Tammy says, I really appreciate your talk. Thank you for the incredible work that you continue to do. One of the significant and generational impact of colonization is displacement of Indigenous people from their lands. How do you foresee the futurity of biocultural restoration in Hawaii in an area where Hawaiians continue to be displaced because of urbanization, militarism, and tourism development?
Wow, that's a very powerful question. And I don't pretend to have any of the answers. I think what was coming to mind as you were reading that question is, our Hawaiian communities are amazing. And there are these key pukas of biocultural restoration that are around, and there are opportunities to reconnect. And it's all happening in so many diverse ways, from Kauai all the way down to Hawaii Island. And I think there's a lot of lessons that could be elevated in kind of understanding that diversity a little bit better. It's not really my area of research. It's a great area of research for graduate students that maybe we could guide. But I think in looking to the work that our communities are doing, we're going to find a lot of inspirations and potential solutions.
Okay.
Any other questions for Kawika?
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Coming, and I just wanted to again thank the Biocultural Initiative of the Pacific. We're so excited to be partnering for the partnership with the Biocultural Initiative and ISR. Kawika, I want to thank Tamara and Gary Welch from Biocultural Initiative and Kelsey for being an amazing GA all semester and really helping to revive Biocultural Initiatives. So Kelsey's done so much work here, and I wanted to thank some of the ISR staff and graduate students, Chrissy and Ellie, for doing all the food, and Teddy and McKenna, of course, for being our fearless ISR faculty director team. So thank you so much. We will have another seminar series next year, and say hi to all of your friendly ISR graduate students and alumni. Okay. Well, hello, everyone.